Without a people's army, the people have nothing. Mao. I guess you make the argument that people need to defend themselves. Look, I guess I disagree that the people need an army. I think the people need to be organized. I think you're looking at this kind of armed rebellion, but I don't think the rebellion needs to be armed. People just need to assert themselves. It's a little bit different than those things. Like, I don't think people always look back in time for what to do going forward. So Bernie Sanders looks back and he thinks labor, like unions and everything else. Even unions have been decimated in this country. I would argue that worker co-ops is somewhat of a better model, because the goal should be to destroy the capitalist class, not necessarily to work with the capitalist class, keeping the contradictions. Creating the worker co-op thing, at the very least, puts labor, or puts the means of production in the hands of workers. It's a different way from the standpoint of having government being the thing that owns everything, but at the very least it gives you this thing of removing this grotesque element of our society and allowing 95% of the wealth, instead of it going to the top 1%, to have that wealth to be shared with the workers that produce that wealth. Now, I don't necessarily think you need an army for that, and I don't even know if you win with an army for that, seeing as, you know, the country has pot-belly helicopters and nuclear weapons. I guess you can make an argument that it's depending on how much you can massacre the other country, or how many you can massacre your troops, or massacre the people who are in the country. But I would say this, just looking at the example of France, the moment that it turned violent, the public may turn against you, because regardless of what the public wants, order is one of the things that the public cares about. And if the majority of the public wants order, and you guys are setting shit on fire and you're running around with guns, they may actually turn against your interests. I don't know if I'm agreeing fully with this idea that all of these people need to be armed. I would agree with you that during the time of the Russian Revolution, where there was a czar, and these guys were troops, and these guys were in the borders and everything else, the moment that they got their hands on guns, they can make a choice in order to change their mind in regards to deposing the czar. Like Lenin said, the only choice, or the only decision, is, do you shoot the czar? Now, the answer turned out to be yes, you shoot the czar. But we're in a different time. I would argue we're in a different time. I would argue we're in a different time. And by the way, there's no way to know what that violent revolution turns out to be. Like, just because you have people with guns doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be left-wingers. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to implement the government that you want. I mean, that's a very sketchy solution. That's all. Ultimately, asserting ourselves leads to repression. Yes, burning a guillotine. Jeb wasn't at the funeral because they wouldn't have asked him to carry the casket. He didn't want to let his dad down. Oh, that's so wrong. Jeb wasn't at the funeral because they would have asked him to carry the casket, and he wouldn't want to let his dad down one last time. Oh, that's wrong. That's so wrong. Funny. He's not manly enough to carry the casket or to let his dead dad down. That's fucked up. Oh, that's wrong. Winslow. Zizek points out the violent resistance doesn't have to mean physical. Yes. Standing in somebody's way, refusing to work in the airlines, that would bring this country to a halt. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be violent. I understand what you mean of, you know, the workers need to protect themselves. But there are other ways for asserting yourself in a society as opposed to picking up a weapon. Just saying. And by the way, you know, when Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement was trying to make a decision on how to go about his affairs, meaning if you're trying to have a siege campaign against a system that's overwhelmingly against you. And by the way, the tactics that King and Malcolm X and these guys in the civil rights were using is instructive. I mean, ultimately what you're trying to say is you need to overturn a particular system, not necessarily individual, even though the individuals are, you know, kind of like the robots that are protecting the system. Ultimately, what you're talking about is a fundamental change in the way that we go about our affairs from the standpoint of a systemic standpoint, how we organize ourselves. That's what you're talking about. In the same way that the civil rights movement was trying to literally overturn a system, people that were born and raised into a system that saw them as being inferior, trying to overturn that, overturn the legal structure that was put into place in order to keep those people repressed. That's what you're talking about. It's similar in a sense, but the scope is larger. Instead of it being a civil rights movement, you're talking about a human rights movement where there's a radical change. Fact of the matter is, Martin Luther King didn't pick up a gun. Yes, he was a minister, but also it wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have worked. Peaceful resistance was monstrous. I mean, understand what you're talking about. You're talking about a moral high ground because we're not taking up arms. You're beating us. You're hurting us. Our bodies was the thing that you put on the line. It is, I would argue, more brave to not pick up a gun, knowing when you're going to cross a bridge that those cops are going to be beating the shit out of you, that you may have a broken jaw, you may have a broken arm, you're going to get injured, and then you're going to get dragged and put into a jail cell. But when everybody else sees it, they're like, oh my God, look at those fucking cops. They're beating the shit out of those people. I guess I'm making the point to you that there's a difference between those guys picking up a weapon and fighting cops, as opposed to those guys peacefully resisting. There's a difference in those things. The perspective of those things are different. Even though you had the majority of whites at the time didn't necessarily see that there was an issue with civil rights. They thought this is just the way the world is. The world is perfectly fine. Why are all these darkies bitching and moaning? They didn't like that. They didn't like that. What I suggest to you is that you will lose the overwhelming majority of the public, or a large section of the public, the moment that they see you taking up a weapon and being violent. This system is the only thing that they've known from the time that they were kids. And from their standpoint, this is the way the world is. You are upturning the world order for them. It's one thing to turn that world order when you have a certain degree of agreement. It's another thing to try to do that when you don't. Right now in France, 70% of the public agrees with the yellow jackets. 80% disagree with the violence. That is instructive. People like order. Even if it's order that is somewhat repressive, they will prefer order, and they would choose order over a situation where you are talking about some kind of violent overthrow where the outcome is somewhat sketchy and unclear. Washington Villager, I understand where you're coming from, but I disagree with you. The Black Panther Party got their largest recruitment after the assassination of MLK. Yes, people were angry. The black people also realized that pacifism wasn't viable. No, pacifism was viable. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you today. I'm just saying, the very fact that I am here, that I am talking to you, even the argument that I'm traveling, going from point A to point B, there's a certain degree of agency that was gained through those movements. It wasn't necessarily overnight. And many of the African Americans that were involved in the process thought this wasn't working, this isn't going anywhere, this isn't moving fast enough, my situation hasn't changed. And within the context of history, again, I make this argument about Cedar, for that matter. In the context of one specific election, no, you don't see it. Over the context of 20, 30 years, there is change. Now, in the case of the political space, it's moved further to the right. But in the case of the civil rights space, it moved further to the left. I'm sorry, it has moved further to the left. And here's another point. The fact that you can use, that guy's racist or that guy's sexist means that from a hegemonic point of view, the left has won that argument, at least for the time being. Just saying. Just saying. I don't agree with you on this. Don't agree with you on this at all. Read Nigger with Guns by Williams. They were doing black self-defense militias in the late 1950s in the South. When Ronald Reagan was running for office in California, I think it was California, Ronald Reagan was talking about stopping people from using guns. Now, the reason why Ronald Reagan was talking about stopping people from using guns is an amazing scenario because it's a Republican talking about gun control, was because he saw armed African Americans and it freaked him out. Now, the point I'm making to you is, if if the television and the media and social media and all of these things are putting out images where there are people with guns and militias and all this other stuff, you will lose that support. And there is no revolution without mass support. I'm just saying. He was not talking gun control. They passed it. Right, they passed it. These Negroes are running around with guns. We need to put a stop to this shit. I am telling you, Martian Villager, I am telling you. The new Jim Crow begs to differ. Look, I agree with you that we have a fucked up prison system. I would agree with you that the laws that are put in place are unfair from the standpoint of, you know, like crack cocaine versus that type of stuff, or African Americans get longer sentences and everything. I agree. But be honest. Be honest. Be very honest. Are you telling me that from the standpoint of the 60s to the standpoint of 2000, that there is not a difference, a significant difference in agency that an African American has in a society as opposed to now? I mean, come on. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? The gains of the Civil Rights Act was largely symbolic. Sir, I beg to differ with you. I fundamentally beg to differ with you on that. That is nonsense. You have an ideological point of view that is missing the reality of things. Are you telling me that from the 60s to now that all of that was largely symbolic? That is nonsense. I'm sorry, dude, that's nonsense. You have this idea that this is, you know, back during the Russian Revolution and this kind of Mao stuff. And I am telling you, that is... Look at what's taking place in France. If you're right, that should bear out your perspective. The violence in France is being condemned. Even by people who agree with the Yellow Jackets, the violence in France is being condemned. 80% of the public, 70% agrees with their aims. So understand what I'm saying. The overwhelming majority of France is, yes, we agree with your aims. A larger majority disagrees with the violence. Now, how the hell are you going to have an armed revolution when the overwhelming majority of the public disagrees with your option, with what you're doing? You will lose them. You will lose them. I'm telling you, you will lose them. I think you're fundamentally wrong on this. Gandhi achieved freedom from imperialism through nonviolence. Disobedience is the way to fight the 70s. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. What's the name? What's the name? Rubu 83145. All right. Yeah. France isn't violent, yet it's foreplay. Well, I think the people who are seeing shit set on fire and setting attacking cops, I think those people would disagree with you, especially if you were one of the cops that was being attacked or one of the things that was being set on fire. I'm just saying, I fundamentally disagree with you on this. I understand where you're coming from, and I understand this idea of, you know, the state has the only right to legitimate force is nonsense. Granted. But your issue here is one of public support. Your legitimacy of any revolution is going to depend on whether or not you're going to get the public on your side to carry out that revolution. Otherwise, it's just you and a band of merry men setting shit on fire. You need public support. And just like in France, 80% of the public disagrees. If you have that much of the public that disagrees with the violence, you have no revolution. I'm just saying. I'm just saying. All right. I will end this here because this video has gone far longer than I thought it was going to go. Look, guys, I want to thank everybody that supported the show. Bernie or Guillotine, Rubu, Beltazar, he gave in the last one. And I'll read it again. Jamal, how do you expect Theresa May to challenge Corbyn in chess when she can't even process checkers? By the way, your link to Streamlabs is misspelled. And I will correct the link to Streamlabs Fuck, it's missing an H. Sometimes my computer skips a thing, and it might have skipped while I was talking. All right, this video is going to get sliced up. So when you see it, you're going to see this video get sliced up. I'm going to keep the conversation between Marsh and Villager, because I think it's a good one. Black progressive leadership was killed from Malcolm X. Yes. Black misleadership class took over and destroyed the community, the drug war. No. Somebody dying, and this is going to sound pretty grim, is not the same thing as losing a war. Do you understand what I mean? I mean, ultimately, you're talking about siege warfare, where you're trying to undermine or change the way a system operates. The system itself refuses to change because the system has to have a certain amount of stick-to-itiveness for it to be a system at all. And if it has any level of stick-to-itiveness, it is going to push back against your attempts to change it. We have a capitalistic system that has a strong central government in order to protect the capital of the people with ends. And you have a society that has accepted that, meaning it is a choice. Whether that choice is understood to be a choice or not is somewhat immaterial. It is a choice. The society chooses to get up in the morning and does what it does. The society chooses to accept the order to which we operate itself. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a society, you wouldn't have a government, you wouldn't have anything. In a war, there are things that happen that, again, in a specific context, are bad. Martin Luther King dying in a specific context is bad. Malcolm X dying in a specific context is bad. John F. Kennedy dying in a specific context is bad. But over the context of time, they won. Like, there is no magical door. This is all of this idea that there's a magical door to change stuff that has taken place and accrued over the course of 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years. There isn't one. There are consequences to the things that you do. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King pushing against the system in the way that the system pushed back. But that said, that system that was in place in the 60s, while elements of it persist to this day, there is a sharp contrast between the situation of African Americans now versus then. This idea that it's all largely symbolic is nonsense. Like your ability to get a job, your ability to get a house. Do you realize that in the New Deal, African Americans weren't even included in the New Deal? Like, the idea of calling somebody racist, people's language, you have all these conservatives who are bitching and moaning because they can't be as racist as they want to be in public. That gets across a certain idea that there's a hegemonic change that is decidedly on the left from the standpoint of identity, while protecting things of capital. From a corporation standpoint, they love this idea of identity because, you know, at the end of the day, you're going to go in there, you're going to buy their goods, and they can use issues of identity to try to kind of woo people with their commercial ads and everything else. But getting into this thing of making sure that wealth is held in the hands of the population itself, meaning if you do the labor, if you do the job, that wealth should come to you, not 95% of it going to a top 1%, off the table. That's not talked about. I guess I'm making a point to you that there has been a shift from the standpoint of identity in this country, and going with an ideological point of view in order to pretend that it didn't, it's a fail. No, it's more than symbolic. It's like, come on. Be fair. Be honest. You have no idea. I want Jamal to call Jordan a pussy. Why? Man, you have so disagree. I was born in 55. Believe me, it's a whole nother world now. Thank you. People who were around during that time actually has a real perspective on what things were like back then. I am telling you this from the aspect of an African American myself. I have family members that were around during that time. I'm telling you, it is a significant difference. I mean, for fuck's sake, I don't even know how you have this particular perspective. Look, I can agree with the perspective that there should be resistance. I can agree with the perspective of potential of change and everything else. What I disagree with is this assessment that it's all symbolic, because I think you have that assessment only to back up your point of view of the world, not necessarily indicative of reality. It's not reality, dude. I'm sorry. And everybody here that was that age is telling you it's not reality. I mean, shit. No, it's not just different. It's a different universe. Snork, thank you. I don't want, like your perspective is for fuck's sake. It seems like y'all are saying we face the lash, one less lash compared to back then, but it's not fundamentally different. If I am in the 60s and I want to get a job as, fuck, my light even gone off. If I want to get a job, I could be excluded from that job just based on my race. Meaning there's a large section of the population that was condemned to poverty, not because of lack of skill, but because of who they were. It's hard to get that across. The idea that somebody could call you out a name and it would be perfectly okay to do so, and it would just be normal to do so. Baldwin once said, he said part of the reason that he left for France, because if somebody had called him nigga again, he was going to go to jail or get killed. That's the reality that these guys were living in. Now you're saying, it's symbolic. It's not symbolic, dude. It's not symbolic.